Well, thank you, Mikko, for the kind introduction, and I think above all for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here today. It's really a great pleasure to talk about these things to you all, and it's also fine to see that so many are taking interest in these questions and issues these days. And actually, I mean, Mikko already referred to this. The timing could hardly be better than it is. Energy policy is very much on the agenda all over Europe at the moment. Just a week ago, last Wednesday, the European heads of state and government took finally time away from the ever-present euro crisis and actually had the future of European energy policy as the main topic of their meeting at the European Council. Also last week, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, published two of its latest country reviews that it publishes on its member countries' energy policy roughly every 5 to 6 years. And this time around, the members scrutinized were Finland on Thursday and Germany on Friday. So it's actually very, very timely. And as was already referred to just today, this morning, the Finnish Energy and Climate Roadmap was officially launched at the Finlandia Hall just across the street. Further point which makes this topical is that it's actually today, it's only just 1 day shy of the so-called Ethics Commission, which was appointed in Germany after Fukushima, that this Ethics Commission published its final report recommending the current line of German energy policy to the Chancellor Angela Merkel and her government, and that report was titled Germany's Energiewende, a collective project for the future. Now, as the first speaker of today's seminar, I've been asked to give you a short general overview on the Energiewende, or its story so far. It's, of course, quite a task to try and do this somehow in the space of 30 minutes on such a complex issue. I mean, you could really talk hours on end on this, but I'll try and somehow live up to the expectation. And I will try and do this with the help of 7 questions that sound simple enough when you list them. And they are: what, when, why, where, how, at what cost, and who. Now, as you will see afterwards, it's anything but simple to try and answer them, and quite often you end up with many more questions than answers. But I think they should provide us with more than enough food for thought for the afternoon discussion later on. So let's start with the first question: what? Now, in the past 2 years, since the report of the Ethics Commission in Germany, the word or the concept Energiewende has really quickly become adopted in the English language as well. It's along the likes of Angst or Weltanschauung or Schadenfreude and other really positive words that you can think of. And now you have the Energiewende as well. Now, of course, depending on your viewpoint, it has also become to represent really fundamentally different things to different people. For some, it's really the apex of German madness. It's a sudden and emotional and totally unreasonable decision to quickly phase out nuclear power, leading to catastrophic consequences for Germany and perhaps even its deindustrialization, and for Europe as well, with higher electricity prices, unstable grids, rising CO2 emissions, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, for others, it's somehow representing the brave new world of a third industrial revolution, leading to a sustainable energy future for all, a low-carbon society, green growth and jobs, independence from energy imports, and so on. And so often the reality, at least for the time being, it's somewhere between these extremes. Now, the concept itself, the Energiewende, or the energy turn, or the energy transition, has actually been around for quite a long time. It was first coined by a study of a German research institute, Öko-Institut, already in 1980, over 30 years ago. Already then, the Energiewende was meant as promising a future of growth and welfare without oil and without uranium. And ever since, the definition of the Energiewende has actually remained more or less unchanged. It's meaning an exit from nuclear and fossil fuels and an entry into an energy system that is largely based on renewables, energy efficiency, and energy savings. And basically, this definition has been maintained ever since, although the level of ambition and the time frame for its realization have varied over time. So, and one additional point is that it's of course important for a transition of this kind that it's not only about what happens when it's all over and done with. You somehow have to keep the patient alive all the way through it. And throughout the transition, it's therefore really important to keep a close eye on all the three corners of the famous energy triangle, meaning the security of supply, competitiveness, and sustainability. Now, if you take this definition of the Energiewende and actually leave the simple definition of just a nuclear phase out of it, it's actually very much in line with what has been agreed on in Europe in the past years. I mean, if you look at the common targets for 2020 in the European Union, you talk about reducing emissions, raising the share of renewables, increasing energy efficiency, and also all the roadmaps that have followed ever since. You could actually easily argue that there has been something like a European Energiewende in the making for quite some time. Well, then on the other hand, it's also fair to ask, has that ship already sailed? If you look at the European Council meeting again last week, the conclusions there, it was really predominantly focusing on growth and jobs rather than climate and renewables. So it's quite a far cry from the 2020 targets, actually the line of reasoning there. And all that means that the prospects of somehow weaving the Energiewende as a part of a European narrative is for a sustainable and low carbon energy future may actually be getting a bit smaller these days. But the main message here from the question what is that the Energiewende is a lot more than just an exit from something. It's also an entry into something new, really a genuine transition and a massive effort involving the whole society. And maybe you can even compare it with some sort of a revolution. And in Germany, you often compare the magnitude of the task at hand with the post-war reconstruction of West Germany and the reunification of Germany a bit over 20 years ago. Now, just to underline this magnitude with a couple of slides, I'll just compare the energy mix in Germany, both in terms of electricity and total energy in 2012 and with the targets in 2050. So here you have the German electricity mix last year. You still had a fairly large share for nuclear. It has already gone down since the phase-out decision, but it's around 16%, and then a big bulk of coal. The lignite and hard coal altogether are way over 40% of the entire electricity mix. And the renewables are at around 22% at the moment. But what is supposed to happen until 2050, the picture is supposed to look like this. You're supposed to have 80% based on renewables, and then the remaining 20% from fossil fuels. Now, somehow the picture becomes even more dramatic when you look at the total energy situation, including, in addition to electricity, also heat and transport. There, the share of renewables at the moment is around 11%. It's quite far behind Finland, for instance. In Finland, it's somewhere in 27-28% at the moment. And here, Germany is aiming at 60% by 2050. So these are really dramatic changes to the overall system. And from this time scale, I can also easily then move on to my second question, which was when. Now, this is something that a historian like me is always interested in, of course, questions of change and continuity. When did all this start? When will it end? How long will it take? And here I find it important to stress that something of a momentary snapshot in 2013 is really not sufficient to understand the Energiewende, nor is it actually fair to judge whether it's successful or not based on the situation at the moment. It's a very long-term development, which is actually spanning decades and even generations. And Germany really is in for the long haul here. And it's also important to note that the Energiewende by no means did start only in 2011 with Fukushima, nor will it end by the federal election in 2013, now in the autumn, or even with the conclusion of the nuclear exit in 2022. Now, if you look at the history very briefly of the whole Energiewende as a concept, I already mentioned the origins of the concept in 1980. When you look at one of the main pillars of it, the nuclear exit, that goes all the way back to the 1970s or maybe even to the 1960s. you've had from the outset in Germany a very, very strong anti-nuclear movement against the nuclear power plants. In the 1970s, it also gained more force when it combined with the peace movement, the movement against nuclear weapons in Germany. And then, of course, a main point was the accident in Chernobyl in 1986. That immediately led to a reaction that was very different from what we had in Finland, for instance. I mean, you immediately established a completely new environment ministry, which already in its title has the word reactor safety in Germany. And basically, Chernobyl was the moment when the idea of building additional nuclear capacity in Germany was over. That was over by then. You still had a couple of nuclear plants that had been commissioned in 1982. They were finished and brought into the grid, but the last new nuclear power plant actually came online in 1989 in Germany. And since then, it has been politically basically impossible to talk about adding nuclear power to the picture. Now, as far as the phase out of nuclear is concerned, it took until the Schröder-Fischer government, the red-green government in 1998, to take this up. And with this government of the Social Democrats and the Greens, there was a consensus negotiated with the German nuclear industry, meaning in effect that Germany would phase out nuclear completely out of nuclear until the 2020s, roughly 2022. But a quite important point there was that it was not yet an overall consensus in society. There was always the expectation that with a different basis of government, this line of thinking would change, and actually it did with the current government of Angela Merkel, with the Free Democrats as the partner. They actually did exactly what was expected in September 2010 and prolonged the lifetimes of the nuclear power plants. That was often referred to in Germany as an Ausstieg aus dem Ausstieg, an exit from the exit, but it wasn't actually that much. It was a prolongation. It was a change in the schedule of the exit from nuclear, but not really a complete U-turn there. But what did, in fact, then constitute a real U-turn was then Fukushima. And if you refer to the famous speech by the late Lady Thatcher, I think you can say that the German lady was for turning. Immediately after Fukushima, the German government decided to shut down 8 of its 17 nuclear power plants immediately. And then they set up this ethics commission to think about the future of nuclear power in Germany, and that finally led to the decision then to phase out nuclear step by step until 2022. Political reasoning certainly played a role. They were important regional elections in Baden-Württemberg coming up and all that, but simply to see this as a panicky reaction to Fukushima and an attempt to score political points just doesn't go far enough. It's actually somehow an end to a very long, decades-long process in Germany, and actually finally resolving the divisive issue on nuclear power. Now in the German parliament, in the Bundestag, actually it was basically unanimously approved, the decision on the nuclear phase-out. Only the left-wing party was against this, with the reason that they had wanted it to happen even faster. So more or less the nuclear debate is by now over. Well, quickly on the renewable side, the other main pillar in the German Energiewende, that was also started quite early on. Already in 1991, you had the first feed-in tariff system for renewables in Germany, but then the real change came about in 2000. Again, with the red-green government, with the current Renewable Energy Sources Act, which is a more robust feed-in tariff system that has been then very, very successful in the past 12 years or so. If you only look at the amount of installed capacity on renewables in Germany. Germany has more than tripled the share of renewables in electricity generation in the space of 10 years. Now, within this time frame and the question of when, I'm not only looking at the past, but also at the future. And Mikko already somehow referred to this in his introduction. This process, which extends at least into the 2040s, 2050s, is something that requires a long-term perspective that is not exactly typical of politics these days, with the 4 to 5 years election cycles and all that. Let alone the media, then old media and new media, which are more or less operating on the basis of hours and minutes, rather than months or years or decades. And that's something that really is symptomatic of the whole debate on the Energiewende in Germany all the time. This constant tension between short term and the long term, and whether it comes to interests or costs or benefits. That's one of the key elements there. Now, when you think about the long term, of course, there's always the question of investment security for the industry, and I think here the European side could also play a role. I think we definitely need targets for the 2030s and beyond in order to bring this long-term perspective into the question. Now, here Germany doesn't always act very logically, and then there is certainly a discrepancy between the national and the European politics of Germany in the energy field, but we can certainly discuss that later on. Now, my next question would then be, why? At first sight, if you only look at the targets and goals of the Energiewende, it's fairly straightforward. All the targets are clearly spelled out in the German energy strategy, often with clear numbers for 2050, and then intermediate targets for the decades before that. And the most important targets are listed out here. There's the nuclear phase out by 2022 completely. Then there's the share of renewables in electricity consumption and in total energy consumption. We already saw the slides on those. Then there's the aim at reducing electricity consumption by 25% by the mid-decade. And then, of course, the important point on reducing emissions by at least 80% in 2050, rather more. Now, these are all very laudable goals and targets, all aiming at a more sustainable energy future, but somehow there are always inherent contradictions between these and conflicts of interest and also closely linked interdependency between them. And if you really start to push, I mean, if you try and act like a 3-year-old child and ask over and over again, but why, it becomes a bit more tricky. It's actually really difficult to pin down what is or what are the main drivers of the Energiewende. I mean, is it mainly about climate protection? Is it mainly simply about the exit from nuclear? And these are the two that the independent expert commission in Germany, which is monitoring the Energiewende for the government, raises as the two overriding goals or drivers of the Energiewende. But then there are several others. If you follow the discussion in Germany nowadays, both of these arguments, climate and nuclear, are actually very much absent from the debate. They are not the ones that are driving the debate in Germany. Several other issues seem to be. Then you can easily ask, how many rationales are there? How many rationales can there be? And can they somehow coexist without being actually counterproductive as well? Is it a goal simply for its own sake to increase the share of renewables? Is it about gaining energy independence? Is it about pushing industry policy? Is it striving for a decentralized energy generation as a value in itself? Is it about creating jobs and green growth, or somehow all of the above? And again, from the European side, it's quite interesting to look at the current line of thinking in the European Council between the member states. There's quite a clear focus on the affordability of energy, and of course, then you can ask a question: will this somehow have an impact on German priorities and European priorities as well in the future? Now, to go on to the next level, I would pose the question, where? Now, the geography of the Energiewende plays a role within Germany in a multitude of ways. I mean, it's really a big structural and spatial challenge as well. First of all, it has a lot to do with the location of electricity supply. Traditionally, the bulk of German industry and the main consumption centers are in the south and in the west. And that's also where most of the old nuclear power plants are located. That's also where many of the conventional power plants are located. But with the change towards renewables, the whole picture is changing completely. First of all, somehow on the macro level in Germany, the majority of wind generation, for instance, is in the north and in the east. And of course, if you look at the offshore wind, which is supposed to come online in the coming decades, that can only be in the north. With solar PV, it's a bit different. That's more in the south, but still, alone this wind generation sets completely new challenges for the grid infrastructure. So, above all, for the grid infrastructure, I mean, you have to somehow be able to transport electricity generated in the north and in the east towards the main consumption centers. Then at the same time, the generation becomes more decentralized. So instead of the old structure when you had big centralized power plants from which you then wanted to distribute electricity, now it's going more and more into the direction where you actually have to somehow collect electricity from small flows and then distribute it into the other direction. So it's a complete change of the game in Germany. And at the moment, with the current legislation, there's hardly any incentive or hardly any regulation on the location of the renewable power generation. You're basically free to set up a wind turbine or a solar panel anywhere in Germany, regardless of whether it makes sense for the complete system or not. And you'll always get automatically grid access for those. So that's certainly a question in Germany. But of course, if you look at the geography, it's also a European question. Germany is certainly not an island, and it's very much physically located in the middle of the continent. It's not only the economically most powerful member state of the European Union, it's also in the center. And this has several implications again for the German development in the coming years. It again has a lot to do with the grid infrastructure. At the moment, you have moments when the wind generation is very high in the north of Germany, and the German grid infrastructure is not yet really up to speed in distributing it to the south. When that capacity is completely filled, the electricity doesn't really stop there. It takes the route it can find, and then you talk about the so-called loop flows, where electricity from the north of Germany actually takes its route through Poland or through the Czech Republic, and then enters southern Germany from that side. And that, of course, puts a lot of strain on the infrastructure in the neighboring countries, which actually have not that much to do with the problem to begin with. So that's just one example on that front. But of course, if you look at the Energiewende, you also have to look at an even broader perspective, Germany somehow in the world. And I think that's somehow one of the most convincing arguments behind the whole issue, is the potential global power of German example if the Energiewende succeeds. Now, if such an industrial country is actually able to set the example that it can transform its whole energy system and still remain competitive, that's quite a potential for the emerging economies, for the developing countries to somehow imitate that. And it's certainly something generation based on renewables is a lot more globalizable than for instance nuclear power. Regardless of what you think about nuclear power generation in a country like Finland, I think most people can agree that it's not something that we want to have everywhere in the world, for safety reasons, for proliferation reasons, and all that. And perhaps renewables have more of a potential there to be adopted in the broader world. But of course, before any of that can happen, you have to solve a number of issues that are still completely unresolved in Germany as well. And therefore, the next question is how? Now, the Energiewende still very much enjoys a broad support in Germany on the whole. It's not really a question of whether, but it's a question of how. And it's of course quite another thing to simply set targets and a wholly different issue than to actually find the technological and political means to reach them. But at the same time, this is also of course, a major program for innovation, research, and development in Germany for the coming decades. Now, there are a number of issues. I wouldn't want to go in too much detail on them. We can do that in the discussion later on. But just to name a couple of examples, it's the intermittency of wind and solar that plays a major role here. I mean, the volatility of generation from these weather-dependent forms of renewable energy. That is really what Germany is basing its plans on. There is a sizable share of hydropower and biomass used at the moment, but they don't really play any role in the projections for the future. Their share will not rise. All of this, the road from the roughly 25% to 80% is supposed to come from wind and solar. And that, of course, is tricky in many ways, because I mean, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, you will not get any generation from all of this. So there is with the current structure, there is a constant need for overcapacity. You really have to install, by some estimates, even hundreds of gigawatts of renewable capacity in order to make sure that it's then sufficient for the whole system. Some argue that the need for that is a lot smaller, that you can get a lot of this done by a better grid, a better network. Then there's a question about storage technologies. When do you need them? When do you need that? Is it something for now? Is it rather something for the more distant future? Then there's the issue of flexibility and somehow influencing the demand side of the whole electricity equation. Lots of open questions. At the same time, the whole electricity market as it stands in Germany doesn't really fit neither the renewables nor the fossil fuels at the moment as it stands. It's problematic for the fossil fuels as well. Neither system can really get its investment back alone on market conditions at the moment. So there's a lot of debate on how this market design should be changed for the future. We can go more into detail on that later on as well. Well, one central issue here is also a need for a more systemic thinking on the whole Energiewende question. It's often said in Germany nowadays that it hasn't actually been an Energiewende at all so far. It's been a horrible German word, a Stromangebotswende so far. It's basically been a transition on electricity supply alone. It's not been about energy in total. It hasn't been about demand. It hasn't been about heat. It hasn't been about transport. There's a lot that has to be done from that side. And of course, the fundamental question with the how is also closely linked with the time frame. How can you make sure that you actually take the steps that are necessary to be taken at the moment, and at the same time leave the system somehow open for adjustments and changes in the coming decades? Also, alone from the technological perspective, there are certainly many inventions that will follow, but you cannot simply only rest on your laurels and wait for the silver bullet somehow to arrive. And overshadowing all of this is, of course, perhaps the biggest question at the moment: at what cost? And this has really been dominating the debate in Germany in the past months. What does all of this cost altogether? How are the costs divided? Who pays? Who is exempted? Private consumers, the energy-intensive industry, all that. There are lots of questions concerning equity and justice and also about energy poverty. And I think the next speaker will go into this as well, so I'll leave some room for that. Just a couple of points here. The support scheme for the renewables has somehow become a victim of its own success in the past years. It has done exactly what it was originally supposed to do. It has brought renewables from the marginal niche into the mainstream. But at the same time, the cumulative costs of this all are rapidly expanding. And this year, the annual support cost for renewables for the first time reached the 20 billion euro mark in 2013 alone, and it's still set to rise further in the future. And this has a lot to do with the fact that although the tariff rates secured for each individual technology actually become smaller and smaller each year for new entrants into the market, once you have secured your feed-in tariff rate, let's say in year 2004, that remains fixed on that level for the next 20 years. So that Germany is still paying for the next 8 to 9 years, even the first ones that were installed in 2001. And all of that goes now already with the current system well into the 2030s. And then there's that gets very complicated and tricky with the whole functioning of the market system, but basically there's the bizarre effect that the more you get renewables into the market, the lower the wholesale price actually gets on the electricity market, but that then leads to the difference between the wholesale market price and the feed-in tariff rate getting bigger, which means that the surcharge on the renewables, which is then visible in the electricity bill of every single German, gets bigger. So there are lots of very, very strange dynamics involved in all of that. Now, the debate about the prices got really underway last autumn when exactly this surcharge on renewables was raised by 50% from 2012 to 2013. It went up from 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour to 5.3 cents. It's a 50% rise, which is a big rise, of course. But at the same time, it's still only 20% of the total electricity bill of the Germans. So Germany has traditionally had one of the highest electricity bills in Europe. I think Denmark is the only one which has an even higher one. But certainly there is a pressure on the price issue here. Now, last February, then the German environment minister Peter Altmaier then said in a newspaper interview that he estimates the total cost of the Energiewende to be around 1 trillion euros for the next 20-30 years. That has since then been called into question. It's probably exaggerated, but the main point here is that this is going to cost a lot. It will certainly be something in the range of hundreds of billions of euros in the coming decades. But I think here the main question is how you frame this. Are they just costs, or are they investments into the future? They're not just subsidies burned away, but actually you get something for it. You get a whole new infrastructure, and you actually get a lot of electricity for it as well. Now, just to somehow stay in time, I think I'll move on to the final question, which is who? And there you can easily ask, how many Energiewendes are there? Of course, Germany, with its federal structure, you have the federal level with all the competing ministries on the economy, on the environment, on buildings and housing and all that. But then you have all the 16 states in Germany, all with their own Energiewende plans. And these haven't so far always been really compatible with one another. So you can really go and ask, is it at all possible to somehow manage the Energiewende at all? Then there's a question of decentralization. How far can it go? I mean, at some point you run the risk of a total anarchy in a way if you go into too many actors in the field. At the same time, the decentralization has had a very positive impact as well. It has very much democratized the whole debate about energy in Germany. And it's quite striking that almost 50% of the renewable electricity generation in Germany is in the hands of private individuals. And you are increasingly talking about a mixture of consumers and producers, prosumers, as they're called nowadays. Now, finally, a key point in the vocabulary of the Ethics Commission in 2011 was the word Gemeinschaftswerk, which means something like a collective effort, which this requires in order for it to succeed. Somehow you have to maintain and keep all the actors of the society on board. Otherwise, a task of this magnitude doesn't really have much chance at success. And this is very much under strain in Germany at the moment. But I guess you can also bring this to a European level, and there's a growing tendency towards nationalizing energy policies in Europe at the moment. I think there could be a need for a European Gemeinschaftswerk on energy policy in the future as well. Just quickly to wrap up, is there something like a future made in Germany nowadays? I think the bottom line of all these thoughts so far is that it's a very bold and courageous effort that Germany is involved with at the moment, and it does hold a major potential for the future, both for Germany and Europe, and by extension also to the world. But as I have tried to sketch, there are numerous really fundamental hurdles on the way. Still, that doesn't really mean that the Energiewende is somehow destined to fail. A transition of this magnitude is bound to be difficult. But if Germany really has the patience to stay the course in the coming years, and I believe it will, it looks like it will, it might actually really be able to pull all this off. And it's really by far too early to say whether or not they will succeed, and the jury is definitely still out. It will be out for the next decades, but I don't think you should doom this to be something that will necessarily fail. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope these remarks have somehow helped to prepare the ground for the discussion. It's a huge topic, difficult to cover all of this in a bit over 30 minutes, I see. But thanks a lot for your attention, and I look forward to a lively discussion afterwards.
Thanks a lot. We do it so that we don't take questions now in between the presentations. I think it's best to have them placed for the panel debate when everybody is here. And to my understanding, there will be a box here where if you want to, there in the back, if during the coffee break you want to make a question, please write it down, and then they have people reading them and picking them up, so we probably save some time also there. We proceed forward, and I think against this tour de force of infrastructure of Energiewende is extremely interesting to go more profound into questions. What does this all mean for German employment and industrial policy? And that is a task for our next speaker, Dr. Inge Lippert, who has worked a long time as a researcher in research institutes, but last years she currently works for Confederation of German Trade Unions. Please, Energiewende, employment and industrial policy.